Good morning, everybody. We are just marching right through the book of Job. It's unbelievable. Well more than halfway through it, and we had to leave off at the conclusion of chapter 28 yesterday, and we have today chapters 29 through 33 to cover. And as I mentioned before, at the conclusion of the book of Job, we'll leave off these daily YouTube postings, and we'll just go with the weekly Bible study that everyone is invited to. Sunday, 6 p.m. at Pleasant Hill Church of the Brethren. We meet downstairs in the fellowship hall, and we go 6 to 7, or whenever we get sick of talking. Usually that's not before 7. That's a little after 7, but we just trust that God's got the right timing. Now, Job is just letting everybody have it. In chapter 29, he gives a panorama of his life, kind of a vignette, and he's talking about the glory of walking in God's blessing, in God's favor, God's power, God's word, God's righteousness, and talking about, he said, in verse 14, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem. So he actually, and by the way, that means that the righteousness wasn't his. If self-righteousness is I'll generate my own. God's righteousness is I will accept the garment of the righteousness of Christ and I will put that on. That's admitting it's a foreign righteousness. It's an external righteousness that comes from God, doesn't come from within me. Then he says, because of that, I was eyes to the blind, and feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. And I break the jaws of the wicked, and pluck the spoil out of his teeth. So this is a man who delivered those who were not able to deliver themselves. And then he says in chapter 30 and verse 1, but now. So things have changed. This is how it was when God's light, glory, favor, grace, blessing was abundant in Job's life. But now, they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. So people who come from poor breeding and have poor dispositions and have no knowledge of God and the things of God and no appreciation for what Job did, clothed in the righteousness of God, are now, wagging their fingers and their tongues at him. And so then he continues to talk about how horrible things are now. As good as they were before, they're now horrible. And remember in Pharaoh's dream, when Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh had a dream about 7 fat cows being eaten up by 7 lean cows, and the lean cows didn't grow fatter through their consumption of the fat cows. When bad times come on us, we don't remember really how good things were, or at least we can't appreciate it. It just when things are bad, they're really bad, and you can't. It's kind of like you can't get out of that funk almost. You're kind of stuck there, and that's where Job is here. Terrors in verse 15 are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. Now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold. And he just continues on about how God has really, in a sense, let him have it, or dealt him a horrible hand. And that's absolutely true. You saw from the beginning of the book that God allowed Satan to touch every aspect of Job's life. His children, in a sense, his wife, through her encouragement to him to curse God and die, all his belongings, all his servants, the houses that his children lived in, even his body was just racked with pain and boils and broken skin, and I'm sure bleeding and all that horrible thing. So things have certainly deteriorated. Then he says in 29, I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. Now, just a quick note here, the dragons obviously represent unclean spirits, devils, because in Revelation, I believe it's 13, the dragon is said to be that serpent of old, that old serpent, the dragon, the devil and Satan. That's his identification. We're going to find out at the end of this book another description of a dragon named Leviathan, and that's going to also connect to that fallen angel, that cherub, the anointed cherub that covereth Lucifer, who became the devil. He's a brother to dragons, which means he's kind of like out with. When you're righteous, you're in God's court, you're in God's house, you're within God's doors, you're inside God's gates, and you're protected. Now he said, I've been cast out, and now I'm out with the unclean and the wicked and the filthy and the disobedient. And companion to owls. Now owls in the Bible are pictures of uncleanness and especially unclean spirit. The fowl of the air is a general term for unclean spirits, but the owls have some kind of special significance with devilment or devilry, or however you say that. And it's interesting. Now, in our culture today, owls speak of wisdom. And here's how we get to that. It's because King Solomon, who was the wisest man that ever lived, sacrificed almost all his children to a god whose figure or idol was fashioned as an owl, named Moloch or Molech, depending on the culture and the language. And to that god Moloch or Molech, you made your children to pass through the fire. And so, because the wisest man ever to live worshipped the altar, before the altar, and the image of a god depicted as an owl, now owls are associated in our culture with wisdom, but they're really unclean spirits. There's nothing wise about them. They're rebellious and wicked creatures of God who have resisted and disobeyed God. Okay, now I wanted then to, chapter 31 verse 1 is a wonderful instruction to the men watching this. Job says, I made a covenant with mine eyes, why then should I think upon a maid? And that's a great thing to do, make a covenant with our eyes and hold every thought captive to Christ, and therefore not dwell on or think about or envision women, or anyway. That's just a little piece of advice, and one of the most upright and God-fearing men that ever lived on the earth said he made a covenant with his eyes to be careful what he allowed to go through his eyes. Okay, now in chapter 32, we have a young man, or a younger man, named Elihu. He was younger than all those present here, Job and the three friends, and he had apparently been sitting quietly by for some time. It doesn't say when he arrived at the conversation, but it does say that he waited for all of them to be finished speaking. And a quick point I wanted to make about this monologue, I guess. He's going to give 3 speeches and in the succeeding chapters, but I wanted to draw your attention to chapter 32 and, well, let's see. Verse 6, it says, And Elihu the son of Barachel the Buzite answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old, wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. Which is also good advice to young people, not that you have nothing to offer, but let someone with wisdom and experience, or ostensibly wisdom, but certainly experience, speak, because they've been through more than you have. They might have something to teach you. So go ahead and wait for someone with a more gray or white hair on their head, or someone with a few more wrinkles on their face, or a few more candles on their birthday cake. Offer their thoughts before you speak. That's some pretty good advice. Now, he says, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. And that's, we had a member who's gone to be with the Lord, and he very often said, I've known smarter men in bread lines and dumber men who've made millions. And that's absolutely true. It's not always wisdom that allows us to rise to the top, that enriches us. Sometimes we just get lucky, or sometimes we have the right friends, or sometimes God blesses us for no apparent reason because we don't have the tools that it takes that society says we should have in order to attain those lofty perches. And some people just get there by accident or by fortune or luck. So that just being old doesn't make you wise, but it's fair to think that someone with more experience on earth might know more about life on earth than I do. That's a, you know, until further notice, that's a fair assumption. Now, it says, now he talks on through verse 14. It says in verse 15, they were amazed. They answered no more. They left off speaking. So Elihu has begun speaking in verse 6 and finished in verse 14, then observes in verse 15 that Job and the three friends aren't saying anything. They're amazed. And it says in verse 16, when I had waited, for they spake not, but stood still and answered no more. And in verse 17, I said, I will answer also my part, I will show mine opinion. I think this is a very strong indication that Elihu is the author of this book. There is a parenthetical note in verse 16. It says, when I had waited, parentheses, for they spake not, but stood still and answered no more. It indicates that this is not part of the quotation, that this is it's a special note from the author to the reader. That's what a parenthetical note is. It's a note from the author to the reader, and so therefore, when it says I had waited, it indicates to me that since we're talking about Elihu and he had begun talking, and then it says in verse 16, I had waited, he gives a parenthetical note that they had spake not, but stood still and answered no more. Then it continues in verse 17, I said, I will answer also my part, I will show my own opinion. Say what you will, there's a lot of different theories about who wrote the book, but I think this is a very strong indication that Elihu wrote it, because he goes into the first person during this little pause in the action and says, I waited, they said nothing, I continued. That's just a little tidbit there, and those observations are not my own. I'm taking them from other people, Pastor James Knox in Florida, and I think there was a commentary I read. I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it was Matthew Henry, but there's lots of scholars that, because of that notation, think that Elihu wrote the book. I do appreciate, if Elihu wrote the book, I appreciate that he didn't present himself in the best light. I mean, he kind of prattles on the same way everyone else did. You know, we all start out thinking, now I've got the answer, I've got something these people need to hear, and then kind of drift off into talking in circles and saying absolutely nothing. So Elihu did not present himself in the best light if in fact he wrote the book, which is a wonderful indication to me that God's the true author. You know, if we wrote books about ourselves, we'd often gloss over the bad parts and emphasize and accentuate and heroify the good parts. And Elihu, if he is the author, doesn't do that at all. He just presents himself good, bad, and the ugly. So that's just a little note I had for today, and we'll get into some of the tidbits tomorrow. We'll continue with chapter 34, but Elihu doesn't really have much more to offer than the three friends or Job did. I did one other thing, that what caused the three friends to be silent in verse 32 in chapter 32 verse 1. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. There's not much more frustrating to people than someone who can't be told or can't be corrected. And so you just kind of have to leave them be. If maybe they'll come to their senses in the future, but if someone is convinced they are right, you're not going to unconvince them. God's going to have to deal with them directly, or they're going to have to encounter the truth in a way that it pierces their heart and allows them to realize that they were in the wrong. But you can argue up and down and plead and beg and emphasize and beg, borrow, and steal, and you're not going to convince someone who's sure they're right that they're not right. In fact, oftentimes the harder you argue, the more you're going to convince them they are right. So the three friends, I think, did the wise thing and just, Job's convinced he's right. And by the way, I appreciate that he didn't leave off his integrity. If he had said, oh yeah, you guys are right, I must have sinned, in order to make peace with them and let them come to terms and be happy with him, he would have been a hypocrite. So if he didn't believe he was wrong, he shouldn't say he was wrong. So anyway, that's just a little tidbit. The friends finally realized that they weren't getting anywhere with Job. Now, they weren't offering really truth as an antidote for Job's self-righteousness. So they were, they weren't addressing the true issue, is that Job was seeking to justify himself and not God. But in the process, he never lied about God. He never accused God of doing something God hadn't done, and he never mischaracterized God. He never applied an attribute to God that didn't exist. He never spoke bad doctrine or bad theology about God. He in the end became just so convinced of his own innocence, integrity, and righteousness that he just kind of shut down. And so the three friends then, I think, in the end, finally and rightly shut down with him. So there you go, the mystery of who wrote the book, more than likely solved from within the pages of the book. And I love that God gives us the answers to questions we have about His Word within His Word. That's where you look for them, and that's usually where you find them. I pray this has been a blessing to you, and we'll look forward to finishing up the book of Job over the next several days with you. Until then, God richly bless, and have a great rest of the day. Amen.